My older sister is just a glorified gatekeeper. I can't fathom who'd ever want to marry someone like that. My sister's shrill voice cut through the surround sound system. Hundreds of tailored suits and silk dresses vibrated with mocking laughter. My mother stood right next to her, tapping her red-painted fingernails against a crystal flute, dropping a casual line into the secondary mic. She is the disgrace of this family. I stood rooted to the floor at table 13, my dress blues pressing hard against my tightening chest. More than 20 years of taking artillery fire in the Middle East shrapnel, shredding my flesh had never hurt as much as the sheer cruelty of my own blood. They thought I would break. But they didn't expect the groom standing next to my sister, a Marine Corps captain, to accidentally lock eyes with me. All the blood drained from his face when he recognized the woman who had taken a bullet for him in Syria, standing right there. He shattered his wine glass, shoved his bride out of the way, and marched straight toward me. If you've ever been trampled by your own family just to entertain someone else, hit like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, so I know those of us who have been betrayed aren't alone. I already knew he was going to do that, because 2 weeks ago, the fuse had already been lit. 2,300 hours. The Pentagon was a ghost town. Nothing but the low mechanical hum of the HVAC system and the harsh glare of fluorescent overheads bouncing off the polished linoleum floor. I sat alone at my desk, staring down at the glowing monitor. The bank portal was open. My finger hovered over the left clicker of the mouse. Amount $10,000. Recipient Barbara Dean. Routing number confirmed. I hit submit. The dry plastic click of the mouse echoed in the empty office. A little green check mark popped up on the screen confirming the transfer. 10 grand. Gone. Just like that. That money wasn't a bonus. It wasn't a corporate dividend. It was hazard pay from my last deployment in the Gulf. It was 6 months of eating cold MREs out of foil bags, sleeping in body armor, and tasting copper in the back of my throat every time a mortar round shook the earth. It was blood money. I traded my safety, my sanity, and pieces of my own flesh to earn it. And my mother, Barbara Dean, the reigning queen of the Alexandria Country Club circuit, was going to use it to pay for imported white orchids and a prime rib carving station. She didn't ask for it. She demanded it. In her mind, my hazard pay was nothing more than an obligatory tax I owed the family for the sheer inconvenience of being born unrefined. I was the family ATM, a machine dressed in camouflage. I reached for my mug. The black coffee had gone completely cold, tasting like battery acid and burnt dirt. I drank it anyway. Right next to my mousepad sat an envelope. It didn't belong in this office. Surrounded by classified dossiers, satellite imagery, and the heavy metal of 2 silver stars pinned to my uniform jacket draped over the chair, the envelope looked like a sick joke. It was made of cheap, glossy paper with a tacky gold foil border. I picked it up. Even beneath the smell of floor wax and stale coffee that coated the Pentagon, I could catch the faint, suffocating scent of Chanel No. 5 clinging to the paper. My mother's armor. I didn't bother looking for a letter opener. I reached down, pulled my standard issue KA bar combat knife from its sheath, and slid the black oxide blade right under the flap. The paper sliced open with a sharp, satisfying tear. I pulled out the contents. There was no formal invitation card on top. Just a yellow sticky note slapped carelessly over the actual card. The handwriting was immaculate, looping cursive. The kind of handwriting that belonged to a woman who spent more time writing checks for charity galas than speaking to her own daughter. Emily's wedding, the 20th. Make sure you wire the rest of the venue deposit by Friday. And please behave yourself. That was it. No, how are you? No, stay safe, just a collection notice. I flipped the torn envelope over. The address label was printed in stark black ink. O. Dean. Not Major General Dean. Not even Olivia. Just O. I stared at that single letter for a long time. My jaw locked tight, grinding my back teeth together. They stripped it all away. 20 years of outworking, outsuffering, and outleading every man in my battalion. 20 years of clawing my way up the chain of command, bearing good soldiers, and carrying the weight of a nation's wars. In Alexandria, Virginia, under the crystal chandeliers of the old money elite, none of that meant a damn thing. I wasn't a general. I was just the ugly butch daughter they had to hide in the background so she wouldn't ruin the aesthetics of the family photos. I looked down at my own hands. They didn't look like Emily's hands. Emily had soft, manicured fingers that had never lifted anything heavier than a champagne flute. My hands were weapons. The knuckles were heavily calloused from gripping rifle stocks in 120-degree heat. A thick, jagged white scar ran diagonally across the back of my left hand, a souvenir from a rusted roll of concertina wire outside Fallujah. I pressed my scarred thumb against the smooth, slick surface of the cheap paper. The contrast was sickening. They took my blood to pay for their glamour, but they treated me like a dirty secret. They wanted my money, but they wanted me invisible. I peeled the yellow sticky note off and tossed it into the trash can. Underneath was the actual wedding invitation. Heavy cardstock, elegant italicized font. The Dean family requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of Emily Rose Dean to... My eyes scanned the next line. My breathing stopped. The sterile air of the office suddenly felt too thick to inhale. My calloused hand froze mid-air, gripping the edge of the card so hard the thick paper began to bend and crease under my thumb. Captain Gavin Rowe, United States Marine Corps. Gavin Rowe. The name didn't just register in my brain, it registered in my bones. Before I could even process the letters on the page, my body reacted. A sudden violent spike of nerve pain shot directly up from the back of my right calf, ripping through the muscle and firing straight into my spine. It was the exact spot where the shrapnel had torn into my leg a decade ago. The room seemed to tilt. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, sounding like the high-pitched whistle of an incoming mortar. My sister was marrying Gavin Rowe, the same Gavin Rowe whose life I had saved in the blood-soaked dirt of Syria. The name Gavin Rowe didn't just sit on the page. It crawled off the cheap cardstock and buried itself straight into my nervous system. A phantom pain, sharp and electric, fired up from my right calf. It hit the back of my knee, shooting all the way up into my jaw. I ground my molars together. I closed my eyes against the harsh glare of the Pentagon office, but the dark didn't help. The dark just became a movie screen. 10 years ago. Alexandria, Virginia. The air inside the church was freezing, smelling heavily of polished granite, melting beeswax, and the suffocating sweetness of white lilies. My father's casket sat at the front, draped in heavy wood and brass. I stood at the edge of the front pew, my spine locked straight in the rigid posture of parade rest. I wore my dress blues. The brass buttons were polished to a mirror shine. My combat boots were perfectly blacked out, reflecting the dim light of the stained glass. I was there to bury my father. But in my mother's eyes, I was just a prop that didn't fit the set design. Barbara Dean walked up to me. She didn't look at my face. She didn't look at the grief carving out the hollows of my cheeks. Her eyes darted straight down to my boots, and her upper lip curled in absolute disgust. "Step back into the fourth row, Olivia," she whispered. Her voice was barely a hiss, but it cut through the silence like a razor. I didn't move. "He's my father. And the mayor is walking through those doors in 3 minutes." She snapped, adjusting the black lace veil over her perfect hair. "The press is with him. I need Emily standing next to the casket for the photographs. Your outfit. It completely clashes with the floral arrangements. You look like a bouncer. Go! Now." She didn't wait for an answer. She just turned her back on me. I didn't argue. I didn't cause a scene. I gave my father's casket one last look, did a sharp about-face, and marched to the back of the church. I sat in the shadows of the fourth row, watching Emily, draped in a custom black silk dress, weep beautifully for the cameras, while the mayor patted her shoulder. I was erased. The cold granite of the church vanished. 5 years later. Northern Syria. 113 degrees. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The smell of white lilies was replaced by the stinging metallic stench of cordite and burning diesel. A mortar shell hit the compound. The shockwave blew out my eardrums, leaving nothing but a high-pitched ringing. Dust choked the air, thick and yellow. A concrete wall of the safe house collapsed. I drew my sidearm, kicking through the splintered remains of a wooden door. "Row!" I barked, coughing through the grit in my teeth. Underneath a pile of crushed cinder blocks, a Marine was bleeding out. Captain Gavin Rowe. A piece of rusted rebar had punched straight through his thigh, pinning him to the dirt. His face was chalk white. He was going into shock. A K-47 fire erupted from the tree line outside, chewing up the plaster above our heads. We had 90 seconds before they rushed the building. I dropped to my knees in the dirt. No time for a medic. I ripped the heavy canvas belt from my waist, looped it high around his bleeding thigh, and pulled. I pulled until the veins in my neck bulged, cutting off the arterial spray. The hot, sticky copper smell of his blood coated my hands, soaking into my uniform. Gavin screamed, thrashing in the dirt. "Leave me, they're coming." "Shut up and stay awake," I growled, locking the makeshift tourniquet tight. I grabbed him by the tactical vest to haul him up. That was when the second mortar hit outside the window. The blast threw me sideways. A jagged piece of shrapnel the size of a spark plug ripped through the air and buried itself deep into the meat of my right calf. The pain was blinding, white-hot iron searing through muscle and scraping against bone. I hit the dirt face first. I tasted sand and my own blood. My brain screamed at me to stay down. My body wanted to quit. But I thought about the church. I thought about being shoved to the back row, told I was useless, told I was just an ugly brute in combat boots. I bit down on my lip so hard it split. I didn't scream. I refused to make a sound. I pushed myself up on my hands and knees. Blood poured down my right leg, pooling in my boot. I grabbed Captain Gavin Rowe, hauled his dead weight over my shoulders, and stood up on my shredded leg. Every step felt like walking on broken glass. But I dragged him out of that hellhole step by agonizing step straight through the gunfire until we hit the medevac chopper. The memory snapped. I was back in the Pentagon. The cold air conditioning hit the sweat on the back of my neck. I looked down at the wedding invitation in my hand. I slowly reached down and rolled up the right leg of my uniform trousers. There it was. A 6-inch jagged, discolored trench of scarred tissue running across my calf. A permanent deformity. I gave up a piece of my own body to pull Gavin Rowe out of the grave. And now my mother and my sister were preparing to parade him down the aisle in Alexandria, popping champagne paid for with my hazard pay, while sticking me at table 13 near the fire exit. They wanted to pretend the blood didn't exist. They wanted the hero's salary, but they wanted the soldier hidden away. If your family has ever hidden you in the background because you didn't fit their perfect little picture, I need you to hit the like button right now. Leave a comment and type the words, "I see you," so I know you're out there. Subscribe to the channel because we are done being invisible. I let the pant leg drop. It covered the scar completely. I didn't throw the wedding invitation in the trash. I folded it into a perfect sharp square and slipped it into my breast pocket. I stood up. I turned off the computer. I grabbed my cover, walked out of the empty office, and locked the door behind me. They wanted me to behave at this wedding. They had no idea what was coming. I had my hand on the cold brass doorknob when the heavy oak door swung inward. I stepped back. Lieutenant General Thomas Simmons walked into the room. He was 60 years old with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a granite block with a dull chisel. He smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and the bitter black coffee sloshing inside the paper cup in his hand. He didn't knock. He never knocked. Simmons stopped at the edge of my desk. He set the paper cup down on the polished wood. His pale blue eyes sharp and cold as cracked ice dropped to the trash can. He saw the crumpled yellow sticky note. Then he looked at the thick, glossy wedding invitation resting near my keyboard. He read the name. Captain Gavin Rowe. Simmons knew that name. He was the one who pinned the Purple Heart on my chest in the hospital at Landstuhl after the medevac chopper brought me out of Syria. He knew exactly whose blood had soaked into the desert dirt that day. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't put a comforting hand on my shoulder. Hugs and pity were for people who shattered under pressure. Simmons respected me too much to treat me like a victim. "The Marine kid from the Syrian border," Simmons said. His voice was gravel grinding over asphalt. "You going to this thing?" I reached out and grabbed the edge of my laptop. I pushed the screen down. The hinge snapped shut with a hard plastic crack. "My mother reminded me to wire the rest of the venue deposit," I said. My voice was completely flat. I stared straight at the dark wall behind him. "The florist needs to be paid by Friday." Simmons didn't flinch. He didn't offer fake sympathy about how terrible my family was. He understood the unspoken rot. He knew I was funding a circus where I was the main freak show. He picked up his coffee cup. Go, Olivia. I looked at him. Pack your gear and go to Alexandria. Simmons set his eyes locking onto mine. Let them put you at the back table. Let them whisper. And when the time comes, you show them exactly how heavy those 2 silver stars on your shoulders really are. He turned around and walked out into the fluorescent hallway. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. 1 in the morning, Arlington, Virginia. My apartment was a sterile box on the 14th floor. White walls, bare hardwood floors. No framed pictures of smiling families on vacation. No decorative pillows. The only sound was the low mechanical hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It was empty. But it was mine. In Alexandria, my mother's house was suffocating. It was stuffed to the ceiling with imported Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers, and velvet couches. Every single piece of that ridiculous furniture was paid for by the hazard pay I bled for overseas. I funded their entire upper-class masquerade, yet I came home to 4 bare walls. I paid for their comfort with my nightmares. I walked into the bedroom. I reached under the steel frame of the bed and dragged out my olive drab canvas duffel bag. The heavy rough material scraped loudly against the wood floor. I didn't throw my clothes into the bag like a civilian packing for a weekend getaway. I rolled my undershirts into tight compressed cylinders. I folded my slacks into perfect squares. I operated like a machine, checking items off a mental inventory list. My hands moved with ruthless efficiency. The knuckles, thick with calluses, smoothed out every wrinkle. The smell of harsh laundry detergent filled the cold air of the bedroom. I was packing for a deployment. The enemy territory just happened to be a country club next to the Potomac River. At the very bottom of the duffel bag, inside a reinforced protective garment sleeve, lay my dress blues. I unzipped the plastic sleeve. The sharp chemical smell of dry cleaning solvent hit the back of my throat, mixed with the acrid scent of brass polish. I ran my calloused thumb over the heavy brass buttons of the jacket. I moved my hand up to the left breast pocket. The ribbons were stacked in perfect geometric alignment. The silver star, the purple heart, the Global War on Terrorism Expeditionary Medal. They were heavy. They carried the weight of dead friends' sleepless nights and sandstorms that choked the life out of you. My sister looked at this uniform and saw a glorified bouncer. My mother looked at it and saw a fashion disaster that clashed with the floral arrangements. They wanted to strip me of my rank. They wanted me to be just an initial on an envelope. The ugly sister who paid the bills and stayed in the shadows. I zipped the protective cover back over the uniform. I laid it flat against the bottom of the canvas bag. I wasn't going to hide it. I was going to wear it like armor. I walked over to the nightstand. I picked up a small worn leather notebook. The corners were frayed, the binding cracked from years of sitting in cargo pockets in the desert heat. I flipped open the heavy cover. On the first page, written in thick black ink, were 6 words. Here I am, send me. It wasn't a prayer. I didn't expect God to fix my family. It was a soldier's commitment. You see the fire, you walk into it. You do not retreat. I tossed the notebook into the duffel bag. I grabbed the heavy brass zipper with my scarred hand and ripped it closed. Zip. The rubber wheels of my heavy canvas duffel bag ground against the pristine concrete of the sidewalk. Clack, clack, clack. Alexandria, Virginia. Old money territory. The air here didn't smell like exhaust and hot asphalt. It smelled like imported cedar mulch, freshly cut grass, and generational wealth. The houses were massive brick colonials, sitting behind wrought iron gates. There were no oil stains on these driveways, just spotless black pavement holding up European luxury sedans. I dragged my gear up the brick steps of my mother's house. I didn't bother looking for my old key. I didn't have one anymore. I pressed the brass doorbell. It played a soft, melodic chime inside. 10 seconds later, the heavy oak door swung open. Barbara Dean stood in the doorway. She was 65, but her plastic surgeon in Georgetown made sure she looked a tight 48. She wore a flawless cream-colored silk wrap dress. Her hair was blown out into a perfect stiff blonde helmet. The suffocating smell of Chanel No. 5 rolled out of the foyer and hit me right in the face. It was so thick it coated the back of my throat, completely burying the smell of the fresh morning air. She didn't smile. She didn't open her arms. Her pale blue eyes dropped immediately from my face down to my boots. She did a slow, agonizing scan. She took in the tight ponytail pulled hard against my scalp, the olive drab tactical jacket, the faded denim, and the scuffed black combat boots. Her jaw tightened. Just a fraction of an inch, a micro-expression of absolute disgust. "You're early," she said. Her voice was smooth, dipped in artificial honey. "I wasn't expecting you until noon." "Traffic was light out of Arlington," I said. My voice was a flat line. She didn't move out of the way. She kept her hand on the brass doorknob, acting as a physical barricade to her own home. "Well," Barbara sighed, offering a tight, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come in, but please step around the Persian rug in the entryway. The cleaners were just here yesterday. I can't have rubber soles tracking anything onto the silk fibers." I stepped over the threshold. I bypassed the ornate, deep red rug and stepped directly onto the polished hardwood floor. I let go of the handle on my duffel bag. 60 pounds of military gear hit the floorboards. Thud. The sound echoed through the high vaulted foyer. The heavy canvas and metal buckles scraped against the expensive wood. Barbara actually flinched. She reached up and touched the pearl necklace at her throat. "Careful, Olivia," she snapped. The honey was gone from her voice. "Those floors are original." "I'll carry it," I said, grabbing the thick canvas strap and hauling the bag up onto my shoulder. She didn't ask how my drive was. She didn't ask if I was hungry. She turned her back to me and walked over to a glass console table, adjusting a massive crystal vase filled with imported white hydrangeas. "The caterer called me this morning," Barbara said, keeping her back turned, her red-painted fingernails picking at a stray green leaf. "He said the final deposit hadn't cleared yet. You wired the money, didn't you?" There it was, 10 seconds inside the door, and we were already doing the math. I looked at her stiff spine. I looked at the sheer excess of the house, the gold leaf mirrors, the velvet accent chairs that no one was allowed to sit on. Every single inch of the sterile museum was funded by the blood I left in the sand. "I authorized the wire at 2300 hours last night," I said, staring at the back of her head. 10 grand, it cleared." "Good." Barbara turned around. She finally looked at my face, but her eyes were completely dead. "Emily's wedding needs to be perfect. The mayor's chief of staff is coming to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. The country club is fully booked." "Where am I sleeping?" I asked. I didn't want to hear about the mayor. I didn't want to hear about the club. Barbara waved a manicured hand toward the narrow hallway off the kitchen. "I put you in the storage room past the pantry." I stared at her. The storage room. What about my old bedroom upstairs? "Oh, I couldn't possibly put you up there," she said, her tone dripping with fake apology. "Emily's makeup artist and hairstylist are flying in from New York. They need the guest suites. They have so many bags, Olivia. You understand?" I understood perfectly. The hired help got the master suites. The combat veteran paying for the whole circus got shoved in a closet so she wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of the bridal party. "Fine," I said. I adjusted the heavy strap digging into my collarbone. "And, Olivia," Barbara called out as I turned to walk away. I stopped. I didn't turn around. "Please take a shower," she said, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "You smell like an airport terminal." I didn't answer. I just kept walking. I went past the massive chef's kitchen, past the walk-in pantry, and opened the door to the storage room. It was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. No windows. The air was stale, smelling of old cardboard dust and dried lavender. Half the room was taken up by plastic bins filled with vintage Christmas ornaments. Shoved against the far wall was a tiny hard twin mattress on a cheap metal frame. No headboard, no nightstand, just a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling on a pull chain. A prison cell in Baghdad had more square footage. I didn't complain. I didn't throw a fit. I walked in and shut the door behind me. I dropped the heavy duffel bag onto the bare floor. I unzipped the thick canvas. I reached into the bottom and pulled out the protective plastic sleeve containing my dress blues. I found a single wire hanger dangling from a water pipe near the ceiling. I hung the uniform up. In this tiny, dusty, windowless box, the dark blue wool and the heavy silver stars gleamed under the harsh yellow light. It was the only thing in this entire house that had any real value. I sat down on the edge of the stiff mattress. The metal springs groaned under my weight. I rested my elbows on my knees and looked down at my left wrist. My heavy tactical watch was ticking. The green luminescent hands moved with mechanical precision. Tick, tick, tick. I sat in the dark counting the seconds. The rehearsal dinner was tomorrow night. The enemy didn't know it yet, but they had just let a wolf into the house. The swinging double doors to the country club kitchen squeaked on rusted hinges. K-thump, K-thump. Every 60 seconds, a busboy in a tight black vest rushed past his elbow, grazing my left shoulder. The heavy, nauseating scent of roasted garlic butter and seared animal fat hung in the hot air blowing out of the kitchen. I was seated at the overflow table, table 13, right in the draft path of the industrial exhaust vents. A small cheap tent card sat next to my water goblet. Black ink sloppy font. O. Dean. Not Major General, not even my full first name. Just a stray initial shoved out of sight into a dark corner so I wouldn't ruin the ambiance of the Alexandria elite. 30 minutes late. The heavy mahogany doors to the private dining room finally swung open. Emily. She floated in wearing a backless white silk dress that cost more than a lance corporal's annual salary. A massive diamond caught the chandelier light on her left hand. I looked at that rock. I knew exactly how it was paid for. My mother drained my bank accounts for the wedding fund, and magically Captain Gavin Rowe could afford a 2-carat center stone on a military paycheck. Emily didn't apologize for keeping 50 people waiting. She soaked in the attention. She drifted past the kitchen doors to get to the VIP table at the center of the room. She didn't look at me. She didn't nod. As she passed, the hem of her expensive white silk skirt dragged right across the scuffed toe of my black leather combat boot. A ghost brushing past a gravestone. She took her seat next to the mayor's chief of staff. A waiter immediately placed a plate of imported Wagyu beef in front of her. Emily picked up her silver fork, poked the meat twice, and dropped the fork onto the china with a loud clatter. Ugh, it's too pink, she whined, her voice carrying over the low hum of the room. Take it away, it's gross. The waiter scrambled to remove the $70 steak. I stared at my own plate. I remembered sitting in a muddy trench outside Kandahar, water seeping through my boots, the temperature hovering right around freezing. I remembered ripping open a cold MRE with my teeth, beef stew, tasting like tin preservatives and dirt. I ate it in 60 seconds flat just to have enough calories to pull night watch so the rest of my unit could sleep, and my sister just sent back a piece of prime beef because the color offended her. The clinking of crystal glasses cut through the room. At the center table, a wealthy local real estate developer leaned over his wine glass. He looked at my mother, grinning a wide politician's smile. Barbara, where's your other daughter? The older one. What does she do again? Barbara didn't even look in my direction. She didn't scan the room to find me. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her Pinot Noir, her red fingernails tapping the stem of the glass. Oh, Olivia. She waved a hand dismissively. She does security work. A guard at some base out west, I think. A guard? Emily leaned into the conversation. She pitched her voice loud, making sure the surrounding tables could hear her over the jazz playing on the speakers. She's a glorified gatekeeper, Emily said, rolling her eyes. She just stands by a door and checks IDs. I can't fathom who'd ever want to marry someone like that. The table erupted. It wasn't just a chuckle. It was a chorus of braying, high-pitched laughter from people who had never done a hard day's work in their lives. The real estate guy slapped the mahogany table. Emily threw her head back, laughing at her own cheap joke. The mockery echoed off the vaulted ceiling, bleeding into the sound of silverware scraping against porcelain. I didn't flush. I didn't grip the edge of the table. I didn't react. I picked up my steak knife. My hands, scarred, calloused, burned by desert sun and gun oil, held the handle with steady, lethal precision. I pressed the serrated edge into the meat on my plate. I pulled back. One clean, smooth cut. The blade scraped the ceramic plate with a sharp, high-pitched screech. It barely made a sound under the roaring laughter of the room, but I heard it. I chewed my food in absolute silence. My spine didn't bend. My shoulders stayed squared, but I wasn't the only one who didn't laugh. 3 tables away, sitting near the open bar, was an older man, mid-60s. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, but he didn't sit like the soft, doughy executives surrounding him. He sat like a coiled spring, feet planted flat on the floor. Pinned to his left lapel was a tiny piece of brass, an eagle globe and anchor. United States Marine Corps. He held a glass of bourbon in his right hand. The glass was frozen halfway to his mouth. He wasn't looking at Emily. He wasn't looking at my mother. His eyes were locked dead onto me in the dark corner by the kitchen doors. He was analyzing my posture. The straight, unyielding spine. The 45-degree angle of my elbows. The way my eyes continuously swept the room, tracking the exits, calculating the distances. You can strip a soldier of her uniform, you can strip her of her title, but you can never strip the war out of her body. A waiter dropped a metal serving tray near the bar. It hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Half the room jumped. Emily spilled her wine. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. The old Marine lowered his glass. He set it on the table with a hard, deliberate thud. His jaw clenched tight, the muscles ticking rapidly under his weathered skin. His eyes narrowed into a sharp, dangerous squint. He stared directly at the thick, jagged scar tissue visible on the back of my hand, holding the knife. He didn't know my name yet, but he knew exactly what I was, and he knew my mother was lying. 0900 hours. The air inside the Alexandria Cathedral was thick. The heavy stained glass windows blocked out the morning sun, casting long bruised shadows across the polished marble floors. The church smelled like burning beeswax and the suffocating, sickening sweetness of white lilies. It was the exact same smell from 10 years ago. The day we buried my father. I stood alone in the back vestibule. I did not wear pastel silk. I did not wear a designer fascinator. I wore the dark blue wool of my dress blues. I buttoned the heavy brass straight up to my collarbone, the cool metal pressing into my skin. I smoothed my scarred hands over the ribbons on my left breast. The silver star. The purple heart. They were perfectly aligned. I reached up and pressed my thumb against the cold, sharp points of the 2 silver stars pinned to my epaulets. This was not a wedding outfit. This was my armor. I stepped into the main foyer. A massive easel stood by the double doors, holding a custom seating chart written in flowing gold calligraphy. People crowded around it, holding crystal glasses of morning champagne, whispering behind manicured hands. I did not have to search hard. The front tables were reserved for the mayor, the real estate developers, and the country club board members, the people who signed the checks. I scanned the bottom corner of the board. Table 13. Located entirely in the back, tucked into a dark alcove right next to the red glow of the emergency exit doors. It was the overflow table. The place you stick third cousins, the catering manager, and the family disgrace. And right there, printed in a tiny, careless font, O. Dean. I bypassed the usher in his rented tuxedo. I walked straight down the side aisle, my leather combat boots knocking a slow, deliberate rhythm against the marble. Clack, clack, clack. Heads turned, but I did not look at them. I found table 13. I sat down. I kept my back perfectly straight. 2 inches of dead space remained between my spine and the back of the wooden chair. I did not lean back. A soldier on watch never leans back. The massive pipe organ roared to life. The low bass notes vibrated right through the soles of my boots, rattling the ribs inside my chest. The crowd stood. The heavy oak doors at the front of the church opened. Captain Gavin Rowe stepped out. He wore his Marine Corps uniform. The white trousers, the dark coat, the single silver bar of a captain shining on his collar. He looked sharp. He looked like a hero ready to claim his prize. He stepped up to the altar to wait for his bride. A photographer flashed a blinding white light in his face. Gavin blinked. He looked away from the camera and scanned the massive crowd. He was looking for his friends. He was looking for his wealthy new in-laws. His eyes drifted over the sea of expensive suits and diamond necklaces. Then he looked toward the back corner, toward the fire exit. His eyes locked onto the dark blue wool of my uniform. Then they moved up, catching the hard glare of the chandelier reflecting off my 2 silver stars. It took him exactly 1 second to recognize the face of the woman who had dragged his bleeding body out of the Syrian dirt. Gavin Rowe physically recoiled. His shoulders jerked back so hard he almost lost his balance. The color drained completely out of his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His hands resting at his sides began to shake. He knew. He knew the blood money that paid for this entire circus. Emily appeared in the aisle. She wore the white silk dress. She noticed Gavin staring at the back of the room like he had seen a ghost. She reached out her sharp fingernails, digging into his wrist, and physically yanked his attention back to her. She plastered a fake, glowing smile across her face for the cameras. Gavin swallowed hard. A thick drop of sweat rolled down his temple. The ceremony dragged on. The priests droned on about loyalty, about family, about standing together through the fires of life. The absolute hypocrisy of the words made the air feel thin. Then came the family blessing. "Will the immediate family of the bride please rise to receive the blessing?" the priest said. His voice echoed through the microphone, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. Barbara stood up in the front row. The mayor clapped. Muscle memory took over. I am her sister. I share her blood. I put my hands on my knees and started to stand. I did not even make it halfway up. Barbara had moved from the front row under the guise of adjusting Emily's long train. She was suddenly standing right next to my aisle. Her hand shot out. Her red-painted fingernails dug straight through the thick wool of my sleeve, burying themselves deep into the muscle of my bicep. The pain was sharp, electric. She pinched the nerve with the brutal precision of a predator. Barbara did not look at me. She kept her face turned toward the wedding photographer, a wide, radiant smile frozen on her face for the cameras. But she leaned her head back just an inch. Her voice was a venomous hiss, barely audible over the swelling organ music. "Sit down. This place is not for you. Have you ever been pushed out of your own family's picture? Have you ever been told that your sacrifices were not good enough to earn a seat at the table? Hit the like button right now. Leave a comment and type the word shadow so I know you understand what it feels like to be erased. Subscribe to the channel. We are going to step out of the dark together." The blood rushed to my ears, a dull roar masking the choir. The sting of her nails radiated down to my elbow. I looked at her frozen plastic smile. I looked at the camera flashes blinding the room, capturing the perfect lie of the Dean family. I did not cause a scene. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I slowly bent my knees and lowered myself back into the wooden chair in the shadows. The priest said, "Amen." The organ music swelled to a deafening roar. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church swung open, spilling bright, harsh sunlight into the foyer. It was time for the reception. They thought they had put me in my place. They thought the humiliation was complete. I unclasped the top button of my jacket. I stood up. The grand ballroom of the Alexandria Plaza Hotel was built for people who liked the sound of their own voices. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the 40-foot ceiling, dropping a cold, diamond-hard light over the reception. The air conditioning was cranked down to meat locker temperatures to keep the heavy floral centerpieces from wilting. It felt like walking into a refrigerated morgue. I sat at table 13, alone. The catering staff had practically wedged the table against the double doors of the fire exit. It was a blind spot, a containment zone. People in tailored tuxedos and $1,000 silk gowns drifted past my table on their way to the open bar. I felt their eyes. I heard the fabric of their clothes rustle as they purposefully gave my chair a wide berth. A few of them pointed at my dress blues, whispering behind their hands. One older woman dripping in pearls gave me a look of pure, unadulterated snobbery, before turning her nose back up toward the ceiling. I didn't react. I didn't adjust my posture. I didn't pull my cover down over my eyes. I sat perfectly still. My hands rested flat on my thighs. My eyes cut right through the crowd, locked dead center on the VIP table at the front of the room. Up there, the world was different. It was loud. It was bright. But Captain Gavin Rowe wasn't celebrating. He was sitting next to Emily, surrounded by the Alexandria elite, but he looked like a man strapped to an electric chair, waiting for the warden to pull the switch. A plate of dry-aged filet mignon sat untouched in front of him. He hadn't taken a single bite. A thick sheet of sweat slicked his forehead under the harsh stage lights. He reached up his fingers, trembling slightly, and yanked at the stiff collar of his white uniform shirt. He pulled at it twice, trying to get air into his lungs. He was suffocating. And it wasn't the AC. It was the weight of the 2 silver stars sitting in the dark corner of the room. He knew exactly who I was. He knew what kind of blood had soaked into the sand to keep his heart beating. He knew the jagged purple scar hidden underneath the dark blue wool of my trousers was a permanent receipt of his survival. But he said nothing. He let his new wife parade him around like a trophy. He let my mother fund this entire charade using the hazard pay I bled for. He, a Marine Corps officer who swore an oath to honor and courage, sat at the head table and allowed the woman who took a piece of shrapnel for him to be shoved next to the emergency exit like a dirty secret. The double betrayal was a sour copper taste in the back of my mouth. Blood from my own family. Cowardice from my own core. Barbara Dean was working the room. She glided from table to table, holding a half-empty flute of champagne. She tapped shoulders, kissed cheeks, and handed out business cards for her upcoming charity gala. She was the perfect hostess. I watched her path. She was moving methodically down the left side of the room, approaching the back corner. She got within 10 feet of table 13. I didn't move. I waited to see if she would acknowledge the fact that her eldest daughter was sitting alone in the dark. She didn't. Right as she reached my section, Barbara executed a flawless, deliberate pivot. She turned her back completely to me. She leaned over table 12, laughing loudly at a joke some hedge fund manager made, projecting her voice so the whole corner could hear. It was a masterclass in public isolation. She didn't have to say a word to me. By deliberately turning her back and ignoring my existence in front of 50 wealthy guests, she drew an invisible quarantine line around my table. She was signaling to the rest of the room, "She is not one of us. Do not engage." I looked at the back of her perfectly styled blonde head. I didn't feel the sting of rejection anymore. I didn't feel the desperate clawing need for her approval that used to keep me awake in my 20s. I just felt a cold, clinical detachment, like watching a rat navigate a maze. At the front of the room, the band suddenly stopped playing. The dull roar of the crowd died down to a low murmur. Emily stood up from the VIP table. The white silk of her dress pooled around her ankles. She grabbed the microphone from the brass stand. She didn't wait for the room to completely quiet down. She raised her left hand, the manicured fingers flashing the 2-carat diamond bought with my money. Tap, tap, tap. Her sharp acrylic nails hit the metal grill of the microphone. The sharp abrasive sound echoed out of the heavy speakers mounted on the walls, cutting through the refrigerated air. Screech! The amp fed back for a split second, a harsh whining squeal that made the people in the front row wince. The heavy spotlight mounted on the balcony swung around. The bright white beam hit Emily dead center, lighting her up like a beacon. I stopped breathing. The noise of the room faded out completely. The clinking of glasses, the low hum of the air conditioning, all of it disappeared into a dead, pressurized silence. I took one long, slow breath in through my nose. I let it out through my teeth. I lifted my right hand. The thick scar from the concertina wire in Fallujah stretched white against my skin. I placed my calloused palm flat against the cold wood of the table, pressing down, grounding myself. It was the exact same motion I used before clicking the safety off my service weapon. Emily brought the microphone up to her perfectly painted lips. Emily stood in the blinding white spotlight, gripping the heavy brass microphone. She flashed her perfect whitened teeth to the crowd. "I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone for coming out tonight," Emily said, her voice echoing through the massive speakers. "Especially to my sister Olivia, who, well, she managed to get off her guard duty out west to be here." A ripple of low laughter rolled through the front tables. Emily leaned into the mic, warming up to the crowd. "Seriously, my sister is just a glorified gatekeeper. She checks IDs. I can't fathom who'd ever want to marry someone like that." The laughter grew louder. Barbara Dean, standing near the dessert table, didn't miss her cue. She tapped her red-painted fingernails against her crystal champagne flute. She leaned into the secondary mic set up for toasts. "She is the disgrace of this family." Barbara said, her voice smooth and dripping with fake, weary humor. "We just try to hide her in the back." The room erupted. 50 people in tailored suits and silk gowns brayed like hyenas. They slapped the mahogany tables. They raised their glasses in a mocking toast to the ugly sister shoved next to the fire exit. I sat at table 13. My scarred hands rested flat on the wood. I took one breath. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped hard against the floor. I stood up. I didn't slouch. I didn't hide. I pulled my shoulders back and locked my spine. I stepped out from the shadows of the alcove directly into the harsh glare of the chandelier light. The light hit the heavy silver stars pinned to my epaulets. They flashed cold and brilliant. At the center table, the laughter suddenly died in Gavin Rowe's throat. Gavin's hand was wrapped tight around a heavy crystal Scotch glass. His eyes were wide locked onto the silver stars on my shoulders, then dropping to the jagged white scar visible on the back of my hand. The memory of the Syrian dirt, the blood and the mortar fire hit him like a physical blow. He squeezed his hand. Crack! The thick crystal glass shattered inside his fist. Sharp shards of glass sliced through his palm. Blood instantly welled up, dripping down his fingers and splashing dark red onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Gavin! Oh my God!" Emily shrieked, dropping the microphone to her side. She lunged forward, her hands reaching out to grab his bleeding arm. "What are you doing?" Gavin didn't look at her. He didn't look at the blood on the table. He threw his arm out violently, shoving his bride away. Emily stumbled backward, the heel of her shoe catching on the hem of her expensive silk dress. Gavin stood up. He kicked his chair out of the way. He didn't walk. He marched. He strode past the VIP tables, past the mayor, past the real estate developers. His black military shoes hit the polished wood floor with heavy, brutal force. He ignored the blood dripping from his hand onto the floorboards. He marched straight toward table 13. Toward me. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The jazz band stopped playing. The only sound in the massive room was the heavy rhythmic thud of Gavin Rowe's boots. He stopped exactly 2 paces in front of me. He brought his feet together. The heels of his shoes slammed into each other. Smack! The sharp crack of the leather echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. Gavin snapped his right arm up his hand, forming a rigid knife-edge blade. He brought his fingertips precisely to the edge of his right eyebrow. A perfect 45-degree salute. He held the salute. His chest heaved. Blood dripped from his left hand onto the floor. He didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke directly to me, but he projected his voice from his diaphragm. He roared, his voice shaking the crystal on the tables. "Ma'am, I beg your forgiveness for the absolute ignorance of my wife." The words hit the room like a bomb. Gavin turned his head slightly, glaring back at the stunned crowd. His voice cracked with a mixture of shame and raw, desperate respect. "This is Major General Olivia Dean, United States Marine Corps. She is not a guard. She is the woman who took a piece of mortar shrapnel to her leg to drag my bleeding body out of a firefight in Syria. I am only standing in this room because she traded her flesh for mine." Silence. A heavy, suffocating, absolute silence slammed down on the ballroom. At the front of the room, Emily's jaw dropped open. The microphone slipped from her fingers. It hit the wooden floor. Screech! The harsh whining feedback tore through the speakers, making everyone wince. Barbara Dean froze. Her champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the floor, shattering into 100 pieces. No one looked at them. Over by the bar table, too. The old man in the charcoal suit with the Marine Corps pin on his lapel pushed his chair back. He threw his linen napkin onto the table. He stood up. He snapped to attention. He raised his hand and executed a sharp, rigid salute. At table 8, a younger man with a prosthetic leg stood up. He squared his shoulders and saluted. At table 5, an older woman with a severe haircut stood up. She saluted. One by one, 6 different people scattered across the ballroom. People who knew the weight of the uniform. People who understood the cost of the blood stood up in the dead silence. 6 rigid, unwavering salutes cutting through the sea of expensive silk and tailored suits. They formed a silent, unbreakable wall of honor around me, right in the middle of my family's territory of lies. I looked at Gavin Rowe. I looked at the blood on his hand. I slowly raised my hand and returned the salute. I dropped my arm. At ease, Captain. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at my sister. I turned my back on the entire room, walked past the emergency exit, and pushed the heavy metal door open. The heavy brass door of the emergency exit swung shut behind me, cutting off the dead silence of the ballroom. I stepped out into the long carpeted corridor of the hotel. The air out here smelled like industrial floor cleaner and stale cigarette smoke leaking in from the loading dock. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I took long, even strides, my combat boots sinking slightly into the thick, patterned carpet. The heavy metal door banged open again. "Olivia, stop." The voice was shrill, desperate. It didn't sound like the polished, honey-dipped tone of the Alexandria Country Club. It sounded like an animal caught in a trap. I kept walking. Clack, clack, clack. Behind me, I heard the frantic, uneven sound of stiletto heels digging into the carpet. She was running. Barbara Dean, the woman who would rather die than be seen sweating in public, was literally sprinting down a hotel hallway. "Olivia," I said, "stop right now." She caught up to me just before the glass revolving doors leading out to the valet stand. She grabbed the dark blue wool of my sleeve and pulled hard, physically throwing herself in front of me to block my path. I stopped. I looked down at her. The flawless mask was gone. The expensive foundation on her face had cracked, melting under a sudden sheet of nervous sweat. Her stiff blonde hair was frayed around the edges. She was panting, her chest heaving under the silk dress, blowing the heavy scent of stale champagne and sour breath into the space between us. Back in the ballroom, I could see the flashes of cell phone cameras through the small glass window of the heavy doors. The elite guests of Alexandria weren't eating their prime rib. They were standing on their toes, filming the aftermath of the explosion. Barbara saw the cameras too. Her eyes darted wildly toward the glass. Panic, raw and ugly, twisted her features. She looked back at me. She didn't look at the 2 silver stars on my shoulders. She didn't look down at my leg to check if the shrapnel wound that Gavin Rowe screamed about was real. She didn't care about the blood I lost. "You have to go back in there." Barbara gasped, her fingers digging into my arm. "You have to tell them it was a joke, an exaggeration. The mayor's press secretary is at table 4, Olivia. Do you have any idea what the Washington Post will do with this? They'll say I took charity money from a wounded veteran to pay for a wedding. It's social suicide." She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She was begging for PR control. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. For the last 20 years, I'd held out a microscopic shred of hope that somewhere buried under the Chanel perfume and the Persian rugs, she actually loved me. I thought, if I just sent enough hazard pay, if I just stayed quiet enough in the background, if I just took enough bullets to make the family proud, she would finally look at me the way she looked at Emily. That hope died right there in the hotel hallway. It didn't die with a scream. It died with a cold, absolute silence. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a deep, chilling pity. I reached up and clamped my calloused hand over her wrist. The thick scar on the back of my hand pressed against her soft, manicured skin. I squeezed, just hard enough to let her feel the grip of someone who had strangled insurgents in the dark. Barbara gasped, her eyes widening. She let go of my sleeve. I dropped her arm. "You never saw me as a human being," I said. My voice was a flat line. No emotion, no tears, just a coroner reading a time of death. "You looked at me and you saw an ATM. You saw an ugly stain you had to hide so you could pretend you were perfect. Olivia pleased the cameras. I paid for the centerpieces. I paid for the Wagyu beef. I paid for the diamond on your golden child's finger with money I earned while picking shrapnel out of my own leg. Don't do this to the family," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage and terror. "I don't have a family," I said. Barbara's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her red-painted fingernails hung limply at her sides, trembling against the expensive silk of her dress. I took one step forward, forcing her to step back or get run over. She stumbled backward, her stiletto heel catching on the carpet. "The era of me shrinking down to be the ugly background prop for your little masquerade is over," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "You are dead to me. Do not ever contact me again." I didn't wait for her to process it. I stepped around her frozen body. I hit the heavy brass bar of the revolving glass door. I stepped out into the freezing night air. The bitter wind off the Potomac River hit my face, smelling of rain and cold asphalt. It was the cleanest air I'd breathed in 10 years. I walked out into the dark. I didn't look back. 2 months later, the flashbulbs popped in the Pentagon press briefing room, blinding and relentless. I stood at the heavy wooden podium. I wore my dress blues one last time. I didn't look directly at the camera lenses. I looked just above them, maintaining the 1,000-yard stare that kept me alive in the desert. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Sentinel Fund. I said into the thick cluster of microphones. My voice was steady, cutting through the low murmur of the press corps. This is a legal defense foundation. It is strictly dedicated to protecting active duty service members and combat veterans from financial abuse, specifically financial exploitation committed by their own civilian family members. I didn't say Barbara Dean's name. I didn't mention the Alexandria Country Club. I didn't have to. Military reporters are like bloodhounds tracking a wounded deer. Give them a drop of blood and they will find the body. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Navy Times and the Washington Post ran the story online. They dug into the public records. They connected the dots between my hazard pay, the charity galas, and Emily's lavish wedding. Barbara's flawless reputation in Virginia was pulverized overnight. She was officially a pariah. The old money crowd doesn't tolerate bad PR. They cut her out faster than a rotting appendix. A week later, Lieutenant General Simmons slid a thick manila folder across his desk. I picked up a heavy black pen. I pressed the tip into the paper, signing my name at the bottom of my discharge papers. Thwack. Simmons brought the heavy official seal down on the paper. Done, he grunted. He leaned back in his leather chair. He finally held out his hand. I took it. A firm, calloused grip from an old war dog. You fought a good war, Olivia. All of them. I packed up my canvas duffel bag and drove north. I left the suffocating heat and the political swamp of Washington in the rearview mirror. I bought a small weather-beaten cabin on the rocky coast of Maine. No gated driveways, no imported cedar mulch, just salt wind and the loud, violent crashing of the Atlantic Ocean against the jagged black rocks. I walked through the front door of my new home. The floorboards were rough, untreated pine. They creaked under my weight. There were no $70,000 Persian rugs to step around. I kept my heavy combat boots on, tracking a little bit of dirt and sea salt right into the living room. The grit ground under my soles. It felt incredible. It felt like freedom. 600 hours. The morning air was freezing, carrying a sharp bite that woke up every nerve in my body. I stood out on the back porch, holding a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. The dark roast smelled like burnt wood and survival. I watched the gray waves smash against the coastline, sending white foam shooting into the air. Tires crunched on the gravel driveway behind the house. A kid on a rusted 10-speed bike pedaled up the steep hill, the metal chain rattling loudly against the gears. He wore a heavy wool beanie pulled down low over his ears and a faded flannel jacket. He chucked the morning paper. It hit the wooden porch with a solid, satisfying thud. He stopped pedaling and put one worn sneaker on the gravel. He stared at me. The locals up here talk. They always do. Is it true? The kid asked. His breath made small white clouds in the cold air. Is what true? I took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat burn the back of my throat. My dad said you used to be a real general. 2 stars. I looked at the kid. Then I looked out at the massive, endless ocean. The tight, defensive knot that had lived in my chest for 20 years, the constant need to brace for the next attack from my own blood, finally unspooled. The armor cracked and fell away. The corners of my mouth twitched. Then, for the first time in this entire miserable story, I smiled. A real, genuine smile. I was a soldier, I told him, resting my forearms against the wooden railing. And a good soldier knows exactly when it's time to walk out of a minefield.